All right, before we start today, first of all, I want to welcome back Kiki. Kiki's back! And then I'd also like to introduce you to Rochelle. Rochelle is in the back. She is learning. She's learning the filming. Kiki's teaching her how to do it. We're happy to have Rochelle here, but the most exciting thing about it is that we have just partnered with Best Buy, and the general manager of Best Buy had offered volunteering here at Hunt Community to his employees, and guess how many responded?
10?
About 20.
Wow.
Yes. Yes. So, yeah, so oh, hi Mary, come on in. So we are going to, starting this Friday, our tech team is going to be comprised of, can you believe this? Best Buy employees. All right, so Rochelle, thank you so much for being here. We're very happy to have you here, and welcome. Welcome. She's going to get her first taste of head talks. All right, so we're in our what series?
Masters.
Our Masters series, and it's the Masters of Literature. There's Effie.
Hi, John.
It's me.
Hi, Effie. Come on. Effie's here.
Now you can start.
Now I can start. All right, so we're going to do our review.
Hi, John.
And
Hi, John.
who remembers who we talked about last week?
Hemingway.
Hemingway, yes, well, oh, hi, Edith. They're just strolling in. I'm happy that you're,
Just got out of the doctor's office.
oh, that doesn't sound like fun.
Oh, yeah, it's good. She's out.
Okay, so we talked about Ernest Hemingway last week, so we're going to do a quick review because we've got an equally as interesting person for today. So, what was Hemingway known for? What was his style of writing?
Iceberg theory?
Yeah, what is iceberg theory? Who remembers?
Oh, just a little bit at the top, everything's underneath.
Yes, that's exactly right, Pat. A little bit. He was a minimalist in his writing style, and he just was concise and got to the point, and this was a brand new kind of writing style that had a huge impact. He was instantly successful. As a personality, he was absolutely hysterical. Wasn't he funny? He was so funny. So remember, he wanted to have fame and glory, and so when the Great War broke out, he went to sign up, but what happened? He was rejected because he had poor vision, remember that? So what did he have to do? What was he relegated to? Yes, and who typically drove the ambulances?
People with bad eyesight.
People with bad eyesight. and women. Right? All right, so do you think Ernest Hemingway was happy with that?
Yes.
He was not happy. He wasn't happy with that. So he did what he always does and took matters into his own hands. And he decided that there was an urgent supply that had to get to the front line. It had to get to the soldiers in the front line, and he was just the guy to deliver it. And that emergency supply was?
Chocolate.
That's what he was doing to get himself in on the action. So he gets himself in on the action all right, and he wound up where?
In the hospital.
Yeah, so remember that? Even though he was wounded, he saved another soldier. And this was the first medal that he had gotten. What a remarkable thing to get, to be a war hero, and he was not a soldier. All right, and that's not the first time he did it. But he looks very happy there in the hospital, right?
Yeah.
Who made him so happy?
The nurse.
Oh, there she is. Remember Agnes?
Yeah.
Yeah, so she was a little nervous. She was older than him. She was 8 years older than him. She kind of put him off. But not entirely, because she was a little worried about his state of mind while they were in Italy. However, when he got home, she wrote him a what?
Dear John.
Dear John.
A Dear John. He got a Dear John. And he was so upset about that his mother very compassionately kicked him out of the house. Kicked him out of the house. So he becomes a reporter, and he also meets, while he's out in Chicago, he meets his first, Hadley, exactly. He meets Hadley. Hadley's older than him too. And then what does she have that's really appealing?
Money.
A trust fund. Yeah, she had money. So they were able to live on his salary as a reporter and her trust fund. And so he convinces his newspaper, the Toronto Star, that he would be a great correspondent in the post-war in, of all places, Paris. Paris. And so he sent him to Paris, and he's covering the post-war, and he gets all engrossed in the movers and shakers of the time, and they are called what?
The lost generation.
Yes, they're called the lost generation. Who coins this phrase? Who calls them this? The infamous...
Gertrude Stein?
Yes, excellent, Gertrude Stein. Excellent. You guys have
Who was it?
great memory. You're paying attention. Yes, Gertrude Stein. And what does that mean, the lost generation?
Nobody knows. Oh, well.
They were sort of footnote on the
It was
post
after the war and they didn't have jobs and
They did
all
what
the
they wanted
careers
to.
had stopped and they were sort of hanging loose.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep, you're all right. Oh, you guys, you're amazing. All right, so after he leaves Paris, who remembers why? It got awkward because there was a little...
There was a
Yeah, there was this little threesome going on, so it got a little awkward. Her name was Pauline. Remember Pauline Pfeiffer? Yes, so he divorced Hadley. He marries Pauline. They wind up in Key West, and he becomes the great sportsman. So now, instead of the Paris struggling artist, now he's in Florida, the great athlete. Remember, he's a boxer, he's a hunter, he goes on safari, he's the greatest fisherman that ever lived. You remember all of that, right?
So, he had bad vision, but he never seen in glasses.
Yeah.
So just how bad was his vision?
Just how bad was his vision? Yeah, just how bad was his vision? Yes, that's a good point. Okay, so what happened with Pauline? You all remember what happened, right? Right? She didn't want to have any more children, but she's a devout Catholic, so she also didn't believe in birth control. So that left Ernest with no choice but to divorce her. So he divorced her, and that's when he marries Martha Gellhorn. Now, this is a very strong woman. He's not used to her, to that. I mean, she is a journalist in her own right. She's a war correspondent. And if you recall, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, what does she do?
She goes
Goes off to cover.
She goes to cover it. She's in the middle of it. She's in the thick of things. Ernest, loving his boat, he decides that he is going to protect his country and serve his country by taking his boat out into the seas to scour the open seas for, suspicious vessels. And because he's doing that, the gas for his boat is being subsidized by the what?
U.S. government.
The U.S. government. And who catches on to him?
Was it Hoover?
Yes, J. Edgar Hoover. Now, you do not want that man. Yeah, you don't want to be on his radar. So,
Dress.
so what he does is, all right, so he's gonna get out of there, right? He's just gonna get out of there. He decides he's gonna go over to Spain as well. He doesn't want to be outdone by his wife who's there. So what does he do? He impersonates a colonel and he leads a charge of French troops into battle, which he is brought up on charges for. They bring him up on charges for doing that and having weapons in his apartment. All right, he had grenades and stuff in his apartment, you know, for the soldiers. Well, you're not supposed to do that either. So because he's Ernest Hemingway, the charges are dropped and that's the end of that, right? Not exactly. Not only were the charges dropped, but he earned a bronze medal.
Yes.
Remember? For his time in the war, despite these very colorful things that he had done. All right, so now Martha was very disappointing because she's a strong, independent woman. So then what did he have to do? Divorce her and marry Mary. So he marries Mary, and that's when they go to where? Cuba, and that's when he's living in Cuba, and he becomes really famous there, really for entertaining movie stars, because his books are becoming movies, and he's entertaining movie stars and famous people in the Havana nightlife there. All right, so he writes a book, and that book does not get good reviews. He'd never gotten a bad review, ever. But he had an answer to that. Do you remember what the answer was? And the old man in the sea got him what? Yes, exactly. So now, just moving along, because we're supposed to do this quickly. I mean, I am supposed to do this quickly. He was in 2 plane crashes on his last safaris. And the second one, they couldn't get out of the plane. Mary was with him, the pilot was with him. They couldn't get out of the plane. And they were concerned that it was going to catch on fire. And so he uses his head. He headbutts his way out. He opens the door with his head. With his head. But he saved their lives. He saved everyone's life. And so he gets out. But this causes a lot of damage. And he's older, of course. He goes back to Cuba. And then what happens? Yes. Yes, Fidel Castro happens, and even though he tried to stay, he tried to, just be neutral. It didn't work. He had to leave, and when he left, he and Mary ultimately moved to Idaho, and this is where he began to suffer very severe depression, clinical depression, and he attempted suicide. He was sent to Mayo Clinic, and how did they treat him?
Electric shock therapy.
Yes, exactly, electric shock therapy, which just made it worse. Ultimately, we know that tragically,
Destroyed him.
Ernest Hemingway committed suicide. He shot himself.
Followed the family tradition.
Yeah, it was something that it was in the family history is suicide, and you're right, Pat. Then his granddaughter, Margot Hemingway, also committed suicide. So it's a very sad ending. And he was just a man in his 60s. There was probably a lot more that he had to give with his writing. So it's really tragic. Today, unfortunately, I have another sad, tragic story to tell you. Do you know who we're doing today? Who remembers?
F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yes, we're talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I guess, they say genius and madness, there's a fine line, right? Yeah, there's a fine line. It's difficult to be a genius. All right, so we're going to talk about his story. F. Scott Fitzgerald was born in this house in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1896. I'd like to call your attention to his full name at birth. His full name is Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald. Now that should sound familiar to you.
Yeah.
Why does that sound familiar to you? Oh, you're all correct. Yes, he is named after, do you know that Francis Scott Key is a relative?
Oh, really?
Yes. Yes, a distant relative, but a relative nonetheless, and they are apparently quite proud of that family connection because he is named after Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. Okay? All right. Okay, so let's move on. Let's find out about his childhood because, you know, we always like to start from the beginning here. All right, there he is. He's called Scott, by the way. He's not called Francis. He's called Scott. So there's little Scott with his dad, and he really loves his dad. His dad's a very proper man. He dresses as a proper gentleman, and he behaves with impeccable mannerisms, and this he wants to impart to young Scott. All right, his father at first owns a Wicca furniture store. Wicker, not Wicca. That's something entirely different. And he loses that business. But he gets a job as a salesman with Procter & Gamble. With Procter & Gamble, that's not bad, right? Except he gets fired. Edward is the father's name. So Edward gets fired, and he just starts drinking. He starts drinking. He feels like a failure, and he's unable to support his family, and he gets very down in the dumps about it, and so he starts drinking, and he never really recovers from that. So the family now has to rely on his mother. There's his mother, Molly. Her name's Molly. There's Scott. Remember last week when we were talking about Ernest Hemingway? And in this time, it was common to put baby boys in dresses, but only to a certain point. Ernest's mother went way too far with that. But you can see Scott here now. He's like 4 years old, 4 or 5 there, and he's in boy clothes.
He's here to change diapers,
Oh, with the dresses, is that the reason?
I'm guessing.
Oh,
That makes sense.
okay.
Made it easier to change diapers.
All right, so now we know. Thank you, Judy.
Doors in.
All right. Okay, so Molly, her family has money, and the family is able to survive because of Molly's family's money. However, there's shame in young Scott because he knows that they're essentially poor, and the only reason why he can go to a prep school is not because of his father, and isn't that the norm, the tradition? It's not because his father's able to provide that for him, but that it's coming from family charity. You see what I'm saying? And this bothered him. This always bothered him. So he's able to go to preparatory schools. I know, isn't he so cute? Look at him.
Gorgeous eyes.
I know, he's just beautiful, a beautiful young man. You have no idea how relevant that will become in just a minute. So yes, that's young Scott. He goes to a preparatory school, and he's really feeling the shame of the fact that his dad is considered a failure and that they have to live on the mother's family's, however charitable they're feeling. And so the only thing that sets him apart from the other kids is the fact that he can write. It comes easily to him. He's writing poetry, he's writing short stories, and it just is pouring out of him, and he can do this without any difficulty, and he's finding that his classmates are not able to do this, And then in the school that he's going to, this is Father Fay, Sigourney Fay, Father Sigourney Fay, and he is someone who really supports and encourages young Scott, believes in him, tells him he's intelligent, and he's got this special talent, and that he needs to pursue it. And so he is the one that really bolsters him up out of this sense of inferiority that he's been going through for all of these years. Because he has this sense of self-worth, he decides that he would like to try to get himself into Princeton. I know, right? So he is going to try to get into Princeton, and guess what? He's accepted. He's accepted, and he's going to be able to go. The family, the extended family, is going to provide that for him, and he's elated, and now he has big, huge dreams. He feels like he's going to be able to go into Princeton University, and he's going to do great, magnificent things. He's going to become big man on campus. And so how do you do that? What's the way to do that? Well, you have to be a football player, right? So he's thinking, so he gets there, and the first thing he does is he joins up for the football team. Scott is 5'8" and he weighs 135 pounds. He doesn't make the first day of tryouts. All right, so he's cut. Look, I did not do that. I found this with him all
Really?
colored in. Yeah, isn't that
Neat.
great?
Yeah.
I know, isn't that, I know, I love that also.
That's,
So,
that's
yeah.
the colors. That's the colors.
Oh,
Orange
is it?
and
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's what?
The color, Princeton colors.
Oh,
The school colors.
ah.
Very nice. So yeah, so I found a photograph that somebody had colorized him, so I thought that was pretty cool. So I'm sharing that with you. All right, so he couldn't become a great football star. So what does he fall back on? Writing, exactly. So he's in Princeton and he is writing short stories. He's getting published in the student newspaper. He's writing plays, and he's becoming very popular, very well known, okay? Because his plays are very well received. They're very entertaining. However, Princeton University is all male, right? At this time, it's all male. So it's completely understood that if you're going to put on a play, the guys are going to have to do the female roles, right? The men are going to have to do the female roles. So Scott decides he's going to take one of those on, to show that, he's willing to do it as well. And then the pamphlet advertising the play created such a sensation because Scott is just lovely. That's him. This is F. Scott Fitzgerald. During his time at Princeton, he dressed up for one of his plays. He was playing the role of a woman, and all of the guys thought this was a real woman. So they thought he was just a really good-looking woman. And so that created quite a sensation. All right, well, now he's got to do something to, realign what? We have to change the narrative, okay? You have to change the narrative. All right, so he goes to a dance, and there is a beautiful young girl at the dance, and she is the one that all the guys want to be with. All right, and so what does he need to do? If she is the cream of the crop, then that's the one he needs to go for because he's F. Scott Fitzgerald. So that's what he does. He goes for this young lady. But remember, is he a wealthy young man? He's not. He's only there because of what? Charity, the family, yes, the family supporting him. All right, and when she discovers this, it's not that she doesn't care for him, actually they corresponded. He's a prolific letter writer. There's hundreds of letters from him. So they write, and she does care for him, but there's no way her family is going to allow her to marry him. But he's just absolutely in love with her. And what does she say? She can't marry him. Why?
Because he's a poor boy.
Yes. And do you know that this is a line in one of his books?
I believe it.
Do you know which one?
Great Gatsby?
Yes, exactly. Jane, did you say that?
Yes.
Yeah, Great Gatsby. So she actually becomes the Daisy of Great Gatsby.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
this is his Daisy.
Oh.
And you can tell that she is influencing some of his female characters in his books. He's never gotten over her. In fact, somewhere I read this once, so I just want to say that I only read this once, but that he had saved all of her letters bundled together in a ribbon for all of his life. He had them all of his life. But I only read that in one place. I didn't verify that. All right, so that's devastating. And if that's devastating, you have to do something to distract yourself, right? Well, something came along that was very, very distracting. World War I. World War I. So he wasn't that great a student at Princeton anyway. So he drops out and he joins the army. He joins the army and he is stationed in Alabama. He's a second lieutenant. And while he is training, to go overseas, he goes to a dance. He should not go to dances. He just gets in trouble whenever he goes to a dance. All right, he goes to a dance and he meets, do you know who?
Zelda.
Yeah, he meets Zelda. Yes. So this is Zelda. She is quite a character in her own right. Now she is, they're in Alabama. She's a Southern belle. What do you think of when you think of a Southern belle?
Not altogether there.
Yeah,
I always think of him as being fluffy.
When you think of Southern belle, especially in this time, right? Do you think of very proper and manners and all of that, right? Not Zelda at all. She is a nonconformist. She is a person in her own right. She is going to buck tradition. Her father's a judge. And so she's just rebelling against that. My absolute favorite story is when she was about 10 years old, she called the fire department to report a child on top of the roof at the Sayer house. There is a child stuck on the top of the roof at the Sayer house. She reports that, she hangs up, and then what does she do? She climbs up, sits on the roof, and she waits to be saved by the fire department. So she's a character. She's just an absolute character, and she is ready for anything, okay? She is open to whatever life may bring to her. All right, so he's in love with her. He writes this novel. So now he's going to write a novel, and it's called The Romantic Egotist. And he's writing it fast. He's trying to finish it very, very quickly because, he's got to ship out and go to war. What if he dies in war? So he's got to finish it. He does. He sends it off to a publisher, and guess what they do? They reject it. All right, so now that's very, very disappointing. And but he's got to go off to war. He's ready to do that, and then what happens? He never goes.
No.
He never gets that experience. And he wrote that he had regretted that all his life, that he had never had combat experience. I can tell you personally, I do not regret that I never had combat experience. I don't understand that.
Yeah.
All right, but at least he has Zelda, right? He has Zelda. See this special effect here? I did that. I just want you to know, that was me. I did that, and I'm really proud of
Is that a
myself.
sign they're engaged?
Yes, so he asks her, she agrees. She says she'll marry him, but there's no war now, so he's going to take off and go to New York. I always do this, now I have to speed up.
Some money.
He's gonna make some money because, you know, she's a wealthy Southern belle. Her father's a very important judge in Alabama. He goes to New York and he just gets a job writing ad copy. And he's only making $35 a week. Well, that is never going to do. So what does Zelda decide?
Not for her.
Not for her. She breaks off the engagement. She breaks off the engagement. He's devastated. He's thinking about ending it all. Nothing's working out for him. But he does decide that, you know what, I'm going to go back to my parents' house. I'm going to lock myself up in a room and I'm going to work on my romantic egotist book. So he does, all right? And he pours himself into it, and he does the rewrite, and he also changes the title, and you might remember it from this. This Side of Paradise. Does that sound more familiar than the romantic egotist? Yes. All right, so he sends it in with the revisions and the change of title, and guess what he gets in the mail?
Yeah.
He gets a thumbs up. They're going to publish him. He is so excited, he's beside himself. And the stories go that he ran out into the street, stopping complete strangers and telling them, I got published. So it's not just that he got published, but with this comes newfound fame and newfound what? Well, guess what that did to the thinking of Zelda Sayre? Oh yeah, she had a change of mind. She changed her mind and she came back. Yes.
Doing that.
So she came back to him. All right, I was going to show you a film, but I don't think we're going to have time. The film was about the Roaring '20s, okay? What? Wild times. Absolutely wild times, all right? So it's after the war. The women just got the right to vote, right? The skirts are getting a little higher. They're taking off their corsets. Everybody's making
Money.
decent money, right? Because of the war. So in the United States, it is like everyone's gone wild. All right, there's all this partying, there's all this drinking, all these crazy parties, and we also have something else too. Jazz, exactly. Yes, we have jazz, so we have this music, but there's prohibition. Remember? And prohibition did nothing to stop the drinking. If anything, it got, yes, exactly, because then what did you have to do?
Make that
You had to
gin.
sneak it.
Yeah, we have the speakeasy, so it was just a wild time. People were going wild and crazy, and Scott, who wrote The Other Side of Paradise, was about what? The wild, crazy times in college, right? So the wild, crazy times in college. And it was very risque in its day because it was honest. It was honest about what actually what college boys actually do. All right, so he becomes the epitome of his time. His wife becomes the epitome of that time. They get married, and he's got money now, right? They're staying in hotels, they're staying in nice hotels, except guess what happens to them? They're kicked out. They get kicked out. They go from one hotel to the next hotel. Why are they getting kicked out? Well, because they're doing crazy things like sliding down the banisters. They're doing cartwheels in the lobby. They're having these outrageous parties. They're not respecting the property, so they get kicked out, kicked out, kicked out. There's also a story about how they would be in New York and they were riding on top. They were sitting on top of the taxi.
They brought the worst out of each other.
Yes, they really did. Well, they were just wild. They were living up to the reputation of what Scott popularized as the jazz age. All right? Yes, that would have been Zelda. All right, Zelda easily would have been dancing on the table. So they become the poster couple for the jazz age. F. Scott Fitzgerald is the king of the jazz age, and Zelda is the queen of the flappers. What's a flapper?
It's
Lots of tassels.
who flaps around with her clothes and
Well, let's see what a flapper is. I will take time to show you this.
French dresses and shimmy.
yeah.
Flappers was a group of young women who we associate very much with the 1920s. They were young women who tasted independence during the war, who wanted to earn their own living, who didn't want to define themselves through marriage and motherhood, and who embraced the 20s spirit of pleasure, independence, exploration, and freedom. At the beginning of the war, there was a reluctance for women to be allowed to do anything other than nurse, volunteers, ambulance drivers, which not only meant that they were out of the home and working, but they had their own money in their pocket. After the war, those women did not want to go back into the home, many of them. And I think there was a kind of upheaval of the old social proprieties that meant that women felt the need to kind of explore who they were. They'd been given the vote, many of them, they'd been granted the right to own their own property, and they wanted to explore what life held for them. Skirts were beginning to rise just above the ankle before the war, but during the 20s, I think women saw the most radical change in fashion that they'd ever seen in history. By the mid-20s, skirts were rising pretty much to knee length. Women were wearing trousers, some of them. They were wearing short sleeves. They were going out without gloves and hats even. I mean, this was an extraordinary change from the late 19th, early 20th century. I think to define freedom in terms of dress can sound superficial, but if you imagine what it must have been like for those women to feel the sun and the wind on their arms and legs, to have short hair, to just to be able to move freely, it's an amazing, liberating power that fashion had for the 20s. There was one American feminist, very interestingly, who wrote very soon after war was declared that the door of the doll's house has opened. And certainly for all the ups and downs of the women's liberation movement, I think that war had a huge effect on really bringing women out of the 19th century and into the modern age.
We're so far from that, but it really wasn't that long ago. Isn't it amazing? All right, so they get kicked out of hotels, for their rambunctious behavior. That's a good word for it, right? Yeah. And so they move into this house in Long Island, Great Neck, Long Island. And so now they're continuing on with their partying, but it's just getting to be too much. Too much alcohol, too much drinking, too much partying. They take a little break because, well, there's a little someone else that's going to join them. Yes, they have a daughter. Her name is Frances, but the way a woman would spell it, and her middle name's Scott, the way a boy would spell it, but they call her Scotty. All right, so all her life, her name is Scotty. That's their only child together. But as soon as Scotty's born, they go back to this this life of drinking and parties, and it's just, yeah, it's pretty. It had to have been very exhausting, and you can see. Oh, hi, Peggy. You can see a reflection of what's happening in the next novel. The next novel is called The Beautiful and Damned, and what that is about is a marriage falling apart. So that novel is about a marriage that is falling apart. Zelda would like, do you want to find a spot? We'll wait for you. Zelda is kind of interfering with his novel writing, which is what he really wants to do, but that doesn't bring money in immediately. So what he has to do then is he has to write for magazines, and he writes short stories. He writes well over 100 short stories, so there's all kinds of, are you looking for Ian? Because he's not here.
I'll sit here next to you.
Yes. Edith will do. So he's focusing on this because this is a steady income. Kiki, do you want to get the door, please? Thank you. This is a steady income from him. So here's all of these magazines, all these short stories that he's written, when what he really wants to write is a novel. But there's all this drinking going on. There's all this stuff happening. So they come up with a brilliant idea that if they go to Paris, they can get away from all the party and all those party friends. Do you think that was a good idea?
No, it was not.
So Scott and Zelda just moved the party, all right, from New York to Paris. And especially, who becomes his best buddy?
Ernest.
Yeah, if you're going to try to stop drinking, this is not the man that you hang out with. All right, so they become very good friends, and they are drinking buddies, and they are friends, and they stay lifelong friends, but there's competition between them. All right, you've got two writers, and they compete a little bit, but they do remain friends. All right, so now he's writing The Great Gatsby while he's in Paris, and he's pouring himself into it, and he's in with all these creative type of artistic people. Well, Zelda feels a little bit left out by that, so she starts hanging out at they're at the French Riviera. She starts hanging out, and she meets a very dashing, handsome aviator. I couldn't find a picture of him. And this is her, and then she has an affair with this man, and it just devastates Scott. And we don't know how that might have affected his writing of The Great Gatsby. But nevertheless, he publishes, and guess what? The huge, great response that he had to his writing wasn't there for this one. It was not.
Really?
It wasn't. It was considered a failure at the time of publication, yes. And let me explain why. The reason why I really wanted to bring out the time of the 20s, the roaring 20s, the great, liberated, free, expressing yourself time, is because what happens at the end of that decade? Exactly. So if you're writing a novel about wealthy people throwing lavish parties and living to excess, and you can't get a job and you can't feed your children. It comes out at this time. And so it's not that there's anything wrong with the writing or that he lost his way in this novel. It was the times. It was the times. It was considered a failure in its day. And then things got worse. And then things got worse. What happens next is that Zelda, she was always crazy, right?
Yeah.
She was always crazy, but now she's doing things that are alarming, alarming. She's 28 years old and she declared that she was going to become a ballerina. And so she started practicing, and she was practicing day and night and night and day and day and night to the point of such exhaustion that she had to be hospitalized. So she's hospitalized with this obsessive compulsive behavior, and then she's released. And I have a photo of the two of them in a vehicle, because the thing that finally got her institutionalized was she was in the car with Scott, and Scotty was in the car too. And they were driving on a curvy road, and she took the wheel and tried to drive them all off the cliff, off the road. And so fortunately he was able to stop her, and so ultimately she is diagnosed with schizophrenia and she's institutionalized. And he's really devastated. He's really devastated. He's forgiven her indiscretion. Who knows what kind of an agreement they had. He was really hurt by that, but they had stayed together through that. So she's institutionalized, and now he's really got to produce, because it's expensive for someone to be hospitalized and to be treated. And so he's got to do more of these short stories. He's also given an opportunity to write with MGM. All right, so they offer him a job. He moves to Hollywood. He doesn't really want to do that. What does he really want to do?
He wants to write.
He wants to write novels. He wants to write novels, but he needs the money. He's got to support himself. His other writings aren't doing as well, because what are they about? It's just the wrong time. And so he takes this position. He's out in Hollywood, and he's supposed to be doing some rewrites for the scripts. And when the producer doesn't accept his writing or changes his writing, how do you think he reacts to that?
Not well.
Not well at all. All right, so he's given all of these scripts to rewrite. Here's just a couple of them.
Nope, Gone with the Wind.
Yeah, Gone with the Wind. Yes, so he was supposed to be working on these, and the only one that he didn't give them such a hard time on was this one.
Yeah.
Three Comrades. Does anyone know that movie? I had never heard of that movie.
Never heard of it.
All right, so that was the only one where he gets credit. There's credit in the, yeah, I looked it up on YouTube and I saw it, and it says F. Scott Fitzgerald. So he gets credit for that, but the others, they don't, and he doesn't, because he's just so irritated that they would touch his writing. So do you think that they renewed his contract?
No.
They didn't. They did not renew his contract, no. No, but while he's out there, he meets a gossip columnist. Yeah, she's a gossip columnist, and she just fell for him. All right, he was just somebody that was just, he seemed down on his luck. He was trying very hard to stop his drinking, because he could tell now that, you know, how it was affecting him, and he needed to work, and so she was trying to help him out with that. And he was, he was making some progress with some, falling off the wagon from time to time. And so he felt like he could write one last book, The Last Tycoon. Have you heard of that one?
No.
The Last Tycoon. You don't know this one because he didn't finish it. Wasn't finished. He felt he had a heart attack,
Oh,
and then he was pretty young too. He had a heart attack. She was with him. Sheila was with him. He felt like an urgent compulsion to finish this book, The Last Tycoon. So he worked on it frantically, and sadly, before he could finish it, he had a second massive heart attack, and he died. He was 44 years old.
Wow.
He was 44 years old. Yes.
What happened to the daughter?
The daughter
Scotty?
went to school, and she's fine. She was fine. He writes letters to her.
Boarding school.
You should see the letters.
He was only 44 years old.
He was only 44 years old when
He was tragedy.
it was tragic. It really was. The saddest thing about it too is, so there was a young aspiring author that sent him a letter and asked for some advice. And he writes back and he says, you know what, you pour your heart and soul into it. I'm paraphrasing. You pour your heart and soul into it, and the end result is that you're forgotten. Your name is forgotten, your time is forgotten, you're forgotten after you've given your whole soul to this profession. That was how he was feeling. When he died, at the time he died, he felt like a failure. He felt like he had failed, and that he was a nobody, and nobody remembered. You remember Sheila? Sheila had said to him, I have never read any of your books. I'm sorry, I've never read any of your books. So he goes into the local public library, and guess what? He was out of print.
Wow.
That was devastating for him, devastating for him. So this ending is just so incredibly sad, and I'm afraid it gets sadder. A few years later, the hospital that Zelda was in caught on fire. It's called Highland. It was caught on fire, and 9 of the patients died. Zelda was one of them.
Whoa, God.
Died in the fire. Ultimately, the two are buried together. Look what people do.
Oh, my God.
So Scott and Zelda are together forever in their time, in their heyday. But shortly after, a few years after his passing, his best friend took all of his notes and decided he was going to finish The Last Tycoon and publish it. So you can read The Last Tycoon. You can read it both ways. Where he had stopped, where he had ended, and where his friend had published. F. Scott Fitzgerald, during the 50s, all right, not too long after his death, he died in 1940, so in the 50s, there's a resurging interest in his writing. Why would that be? Is it shortly after World War II? The economy is coming back. You see how there would be a renewed interest? And so he now is considered a great American writer. He's considered one of the greatest American writers of his time. He's honored. Here's a stamp.
oh my.
Isn't that nice?
23 cents.
23 cents.
Versus 60 today.
Yes. All right, there's a statue. I believe this is in Maryland. All right, there are busts of him, but the greatest thing of all, and this is how I wanted to end it, the greatest part of this whole story. You know Gatsby?
Yeah.
The one that failed, his masterpiece that failed?
Yeah.
Well, his masterpiece that failed is now required reading.
Wow.
All right, so not long after his death, his masterpiece that flopped in its time
Wow.
is now considered a classic. And Jane, we do have The Great Gatsby, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, we have all of them.
All of these,
Yeah.
yes, in the library. So if you feel like rereading, please just walk across the hall to the library. But isn't that a
This was made into a movie.
Oh, yes.
many times?
Yeah.
Yes.
That
Were any
is
of his
movie.
other books made into movies?
Yes. Yep.
Hender's a Night got made into a movie.
Yep. Yep. So he achieves greatness and glory and fame. Remember when he went into Princeton and that's what he wanted? And he didn't get it, and he got it briefly, and now he will live on and on and on. He is considered a great American writer. All right, so I know we had a sad story, but it has a pretty good ending.
It's just like many of the painters, they don't actually become famous until after they die.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. A true artist, a true genius. All right. So next week, oh yes, I can't wait to tell you this story. All right. So next week we're going to wrap up our Masters of Literature with George Orwell. They're all kind of like in the same time frame here. Okay, so thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed that. And I will see you next